They called it the wedding of the year. 2 men, 1 church, a love that had supposedly overcome all odds. Guests whispered in awe as the carved wooden doors of the historic chapel creaked open. Light spilled through stained glass windows. A string quartet played softly as people rose to their feet. But none of them saw what Elliot saw. None of them knew what he knew. Because behind every carefully placed rose, every hand-folded napkin, and every congratulations was a secret he had been waiting years to expose. And this was the only way. Welcome to Heart Story. May this story help you find healing, justice, and truth, especially for those who never got to speak theirs. Stay with us. Elliot stood in the center aisle, dressed in a custom-fitted ivory tuxedo of his own design. At 29, he had built a name for himself in Charleston as a respected interior designer, someone with an eye for elegance and a quiet heart for resilience. The wedding venue, a once-abandoned chapel, had been lovingly restored by his hands. Brick by brick, window by window, it was more than a building. It was a monument to second chances. And he believed Julian was his. Julian, 35, was the kind of man people noticed when he entered a room. A dermatologist with a successful private clinic. He had walked away from his conservative family years ago to live as an openly gay man. That bold step, paired with his charm, generosity, and community work, turned him into a local hero, a perfect man with a perfect past, or so it seemed. Together, Elliot and Julian were admired. Their engagement photos flooded social media. Their love story became a model of visibility, 2 men defying expectations and building a future together. But Elliot knew appearances could lie. As he walked down the aisle toward Julian, the chapel quieted, the music faded, the air held its breath. Julian stood tall, smiling nervously as Elliot reached his side. They held hands. The pastor stepped forward, Bible in hand, and just before he began the vows, Elliot leaned slightly closer and whispered, not to Julian, but into the space between them. "Did you sign the divorce papers?" It was quiet, too quiet. But the pastor heard it. He paused, looked between them. And after a moment that felt longer than the entire engagement, he gently closed the Bible and said, "Let's step into the back room for a moment." There was a murmur from the crowd, but the pastor's voice had the kind of authority that silenced questions. Inside the small vestry behind the altar, the air shifted. Julian's face twitched with unease. "That's not what this is about," he said, low and firm. "That part of my life is over." Elliot didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them was louder than truth. The pastor, cautious but firm, insisted on clarity. Legally, the wedding couldn't continue if Julian was still married to someone else. The church's policy was clear. Love was sacred, but honesty was law. Julian hesitated. His hand moved toward his inside pocket as if he might produce something. A signature, maybe. But before he could say another word, the door behind them creaked open. And in walked the woman Elliot had been waiting for. She wasn't part of the guest list. She didn't wear a dress fit for a wedding. But in her hands, she held a small stack of papers. The truth, printed in black and white. She stood beside the pastor and raised her voice just enough to be heard. "I am Julian's legal wife. And no, he never signed the divorce." She turned toward Julian, her eyes sharp with years of betrayal. "I stayed silent. You made sure of that. You threatened me with that video. The one you said would destroy my name, my family, everything." Elliot didn't blink, because this was exactly what he needed. And this was only the beginning. If this story moved you or made you think, please follow and subscribe to Heart Story. Every voice matters. Every truth deserves light. Inside the vestry, a space meant for prayer and preparation, time stood still. Julian stood frozen, his usual composure cracking at the edges. The woman, steady and unwavering, held the documents with the quiet finality of a verdict. Her words had already pierced the room, but it was the silence afterward, the kind that only arrives when truth can no longer be ignored, that truly unsettled Julian. The pastor, who had presided over hundreds of weddings in his decades of service, had never encountered a scene quite like this. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shocked. He was simply disappointed. With a slow, deliberate breath, He turned to Julian and said, "Before anything else continues, we need legal clarity. Are you, or are you not, married under the law?" Julian opened his mouth, then closed it again. His gaze flickered toward Elliot, who remained standing beside him, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. Julian's voice, when it came, was low and almost childlike. I just didn't get to it in time." It was a weak lie, and everyone knew it. The woman, his legal wife, stepped forward, her voice firmer now. "He told me this marriage would only hurt his career, that no one could ever find out. But when I threatened to go public, he sent me a video, one he recorded without permission when I was vulnerable. He said if I ever tried to expose him, that clip would destroy me." She looked directly at the pastor. "That's why I've stayed quiet until today." Elliot hadn't moved. His eyes were locked on Julian's, but they no longer held warmth. There was no heartbreak, no confusion, only resolution. Because Elliot had always known something was off, and now, the final piece had arrived, handed to him not by fate, but by choice. The pastor placed the Bible down on the small table beside him. His hands, weathered by years of ceremonies and sermons, no longer trembled, but they were heavy with the weight of what came next. "Julian," he said gently but clearly, "we cannot proceed today. This ceremony cannot be sanctified under false pretenses." Julian's mask began to slip, his jaw tightened, and the charm he wore like cologne began to curdle into defensiveness. "This isn't how this was supposed to go," he muttered. His wife turned to Elliot, extending the papers. "You deserve to know the full story. I've kept everything, letters, messages, legal records, and something else, something that belonged to someone you once loved." Julian's posture shifted. He moved quickly now, reaching out to grab the documents, but Elliot stepped between them, calm, steady, unafraid. "No," Elliot said quietly. "Let her speak." And so she did. She explained how the blackmail began, how Julian threatened not just her but someone else before her, a young man, a student, someone soft-spoken, full of hope, and desperate to protect his future, someone who once believed Julian was more than a fraud. His name was Liam. Elliot's silence deepened, not because he was surprised, but because he wasn't. He had loved Liam once, before Julian, back when love felt light and possible, back when trust hadn't yet been shattered by the weight of secrets. Liam had vanished from Elliot's life years ago, leaving behind only the echo of a goodbye and a note too vague to question. The news of his death had arrived later, wrapped in the language of tragedy. A young man lost to despair. No one knew why. No one asked enough, until now. Julian tried to shift the conversation, insisting it was all circumstantial, that no one had proof, that Elliot was being manipulated. But Elliot didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply turned to the pastor and said, "He's not just married. He's dangerous." The pastor nodded once and then turned to Julian's wife. "Do you feel safe returning home tonight?" She shook her head. Elliot stepped forward. "You can stay with me." And the offer wasn't made out of pity. It was made out of alliance, one built not on shared suffering, but shared resolve. Julian stood in the center of the room, his charm now useless, his narrative unraveling. The man everyone admired was beginning to fracture, and Elliot, he was just getting started. Julian's face shifted between disbelief and rage. In that quiet room, with the wedding paused and the truth exposed, he began to realize the walls were closing in, not by accident, but by design. He turned to Elliot, voice trembling with desperation. "You don't have to do this," he said, reaching out as if to grasp a thread of control that had long since slipped through his fingers. But Elliot didn't move. He didn't even blink. Instead, he looked at the pastor, then at Julian's legal wife, and finally, at Julian himself. His voice, at time when it came, was calm, steady, measured like a verdict. "There's nothing left to do," Elliot said. "Today isn't just the day I was supposed to marry you. It's the day the truth marries you back." Julian flinched, as if the words carried weight, because they did. Elliot turned to face the woman who had just delivered the final blow to Julian's perfect image. He didn't thank her aloud. He didn't have to. She had given him more than testimony. She had given him the last piece of the puzzle he had spent years trying to solve. For Elliot had known all along. He had entered this relationship with eyes wide open, not because he enjoyed deception, but because someone had once died for it, years ago, long before Julian became the poster boy for progressive success. He had been a med student, bright, charming, and ambitious. That was when he met Liam, a soft-spoken, kind-hearted boy with a laugh that bent gently into the air. Liam had been a second-year nursing student, and Julian had been his world, until the world turned cruel. It began, as these stories often do, with vulnerability. Liam had trusted Julian, trusted him enough to share pieces of himself he'd never shown anyone. But Julian, behind closed doors, wasn't the man he pretended to be in public. He was calculating, demanding, and when Liam tried to leave, Julian retaliated the only way he knew how, with shame. He recorded a private moment, without consent, and when Liam begged him to delete it, Julian refused. "If you leave," he told him, "I'll make sure no one ever hires you. No one ever loves you again." Liam didn't survive that kind of cruelty. He left behind no grand letter, just a torn page with Elliot's name on it, folded inside the textbook they used to share. It said, "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough." Elliot never knew the full story, not until Julian's wife, desperate and cornered, reached out to him months before the wedding. She had found Liam's old journals in storage, found messages, emails, screenshots, and one cloud backup Julian thought he had erased. She sent them all to Elliot. That was when everything changed. Elliot didn't call the police right away. He didn't confront Julian. Instead, he began to plan, not revenge, not cruelty, but exposure. He needed the world to see who Julian really was, and the only way they would pay attention was if the illusion was bright enough to blind them first. So Elliot planned the perfect wedding, designed the perfect venue, played the perfect partner, because he knew the only way to destroy a lie that big was to let it walk itself to the altar. And now here they were. Julian stood in the middle of the vestry, hands clenched, breathing fast. "This is insane," he hissed. "You've set me up." "No," Elliot replied, his voice cold. "You set yourself up the moment you thought no one would speak, the moment you thought silence would stay silent forever." The pastor, still standing at the corner of the room, no longer saw a ceremony. He saw a reckoning. Julian's wife, holding the evidence close, took a step forward. "He told me Liam was just unstable, that he'd been obsessed, but that wasn't the truth. Julian lied to everyone, including himself." Elliot nodded. "And that ends today. Because this wasn't about a wedding. It was about a funeral that had never been acknowledged. About a life that had been quietly erased to protect a man who didn't deserve protection. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But in that quiet room behind the altar, Julian's legacy began to rot from the inside out. And Elliot, the man who was supposed to walk down the aisle for love, finally stepped into the role he had chosen not as a groom, but as a witness. The ceremony was over. The real story had just begun. The chapel doors remained closed. Outside, the guests sat in silence, unaware of the storm unfolding just behind the altar wall. Some whispered nervously, wondering about the delay. Others checked their phones, assuming technical issues. But no one imagined that the ceremony had already shattered. Inside, the truth had stripped Julian of everything but his name, and even that now felt borrowed. Elliot stood beside the pastor, unmoved. In his hands were the documents that exposed Julian's deception, emails, voice memos, screen captures of threats, and the journal entries Liam had written before his death. There were no more shadows to hide behind. The room was filled with light, and that light burned. Julian tried one last time to assert control. He turned to Elliot, his voice low but urgent. "If you do this, you'll ruin everything. My career, my reputation, everything I've built." But Elliot didn't flinch. He looked at Julian and answered with the same clarity he used when choosing paint colors for a home, deliberate and final. "No," he said. "You ruined that the day you made someone feel like death was easier than facing you." The chapel's side entrance opened. 2 uniformed officers entered quietly, summoned by the pastor minutes earlier. They moved with solemn efficiency, guided by the information provided. Julian's body tensed. The confident posture he had carried for years collapsed in seconds. "Julian Carter," one officer began, We'd like you to come with us for questioning related to allegations of blackmail and unlawful recording. Julian's first instinct was flight. He turned sharply toward the side exit, but a second officer blocked the path. The moment passed quickly, but the impact lingered. This wasn't just a scandal. It was criminal. His wife handed over the flash drive and printed files. "There's more in my email," she said. "Check the folder labeled Liam. I kept everything." Julian stood frozen as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. The guests outside could now hear muffled footsteps and fragmented voices. A few began to rise. The illusion was cracking. The pastor approached Elliot with gentle eyes. "You don't have to do anything more," he said quietly. "You've done enough." But Elliot shook his head. He wasn't finished. With the ceremony formally canceled, Elliot stepped into the center aisle. The crowd turned, sensing something was wrong. Gone was the music, the lightness, the laughter. What replaced it was stillness. Elliot's voice echoed clearly under the vaulted ceiling. "There won't be a wedding today," he said, "because the man I was about to marry isn't who he pretended to be. He hurt someone I loved, someone I never got the chance to protect." Whispers rippled across the pews. Some looked toward the doors where Julian had just been led out. Others stared at Elliot, stunned. "I never imagined I'd wear a wedding suit," he continued. "But I didn't wear it to start a marriage. I wore it to end a lie. And in that moment, what was meant to be a celebration of union became a declaration of truth, one that demanded to be heard, even if it shattered the hearts that once clapped for joy." Some of Julian's friends, colleagues, medical peers, donors, sat in stunned silence. A few exchanged glances, their faces quietly shifting from disbelief to shame, because deep down, they had heard rumors. Some even knew about Liam. They just never asked, never intervened. The silence they kept had cost a life. The pastor stood at Elliot's side, not as a man of ceremony, but as a man of principle. He offered no platitudes, no verses, only presence. And then Elliot turned to the pew where Julian's wife now sat, shoulders straight, expression unreadable. "We were both silenced," Elliot said, "but not anymore." Outside, the sky had dimmed, as if Charleston itself knew something sacred had been interrupted. Yet inside that chapel, for the first time all day, something real had begun. This wasn't just the undoing of a wedding. It was the burial of a persona, and the beginning of justice for the soul who never made it down any aisle at all. The chairs remained in neat rows. The altar, framed by white orchids and candles, still stood waiting. But there would be no celebration today, no reception, no champagne toasts, only silence. And then, something softer, something truer. Instead of disappearing after the ceremony collapsed, Elliot stayed. He asked the guests not to leave, but to stay for someone else. Not for Julian, not for himself, but for Liam. The chapel, once meant to hold wedding vows, now held memory. Elliot removed his boutonniere, walked to the center aisle again, this time with no music, no hand to hold, and placed a single framed photo on the altar, a picture of Liam in his scrubs, laughing on the day of his nursing school orientation. That photo, Elliot said, had been mailed to him by Liam's mother after his death. He'd kept it for years, hidden in the drawer of his nightstand, never knowing what to do with it, until now. "There won't be a first dance," Elliot told the guests, "but there will be a name spoken that never got its moment." He stood before friends, strangers, colleagues, and told the story no one had ever wanted to hear. Not the wedding story, the real one. He spoke about Liam, about the boy who once dreamed of opening a rural clinic, who loved lemon cake and acoustic guitar, who wrote poetry no one ever read, who trusted the wrong man, and who died thinking he had no voice. Elliot spoke of their brief love, how they'd lost touch after school, how Liam's death had left a quiet wound, how no one had ever connected the dots. Until Julian's wife reached out, until the puzzle pieces began to fall into place, until Elliot realized there would never be peace until someone named what had happened. That day, in the chapel built for celebration, Elliot hosted a memorial in Liam's name. No eulogy, just truth. A soft light glowed through the stained glass, casting broken colors onto the stone floor. And among those in the pews, one figure sat hunched forward, fingers clasped, shoulders trembling. His name was Kyle, a first-year university student, slight, nervous, wearing a simple gray sweater. He hadn't spoken a word since arriving. But now, as Elliot finished, Kyle stood and approached the altar. The room held its breath. He said nothing to the crowd, just leaned in close and whispered into Elliot's ear. "Thank you for giving him back to me. I thought he left us because he was weak. But now I know he left because no one stood beside him. You changed that." Elliot placed a hand gently on Kyle's back. In the space between them was grief and recognition. Two lives altered by silence, now united in something louder. After everyone had left, Elliot returned to the vestry. Alone, the chapel was quiet again. His suit still pressed, his tie slightly loose. In front of a small mirror, he took off the wedding band that had never touched Julian's hand, turned it slowly in his fingers, then placed it down. There were no tears, only breath. He looked at himself, not as the man abandoned at the altar, but as the man who pulled the mask off a liar, who stood for someone who had no voice, who finally, after all these years, chose not to run from the past but to walk straight into it and name it. And for the first time in a decade, Elliot smiled. He hadn't lost love. He had honored it, and somewhere, perhaps that meant Liam could rest. Some say weddings are the start of forever, but sometimes they're the end of a lie. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't saying "I do," it's saying, "Not anymore." If you were in Elliot's place, would you have gone through with the wedding or torn everything down to tell the truth? Follow Heart Story for more stories that reveal what happens behind the perfect picture. Because not all love stories end with a kiss, but some end with justice.